Okay, thank the gentlelady. Now, Representative Crawford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. Continuing on with that theme, you recently announced a $1 billion program aimed at combating alleged racism in road projects. At the same time, DOT is actively supporting the construction of the doomed California high-speed rail project, despite reports that indicate the project is in fact displacing and destroying low-income minority communities in the track's path. So my question is, why are you dismantling existing highways in the name of racial equity while you're also supporting a project that's actively harming low-income minority communities?
So every project has an impact, and what we think the law provides for is a process for local communities to weigh in on how those impacts affect them. And unless there is a civil rights violation, in which case my department, of course, will very proactively address it, then it falls to the project sponsor to decide how to balance those concerns. But in terms of the highway work, the way I view it is, if federal dollars were ever used in a way that separates or segregates, then a pretty good use of federal dollars now would be to connect and to address those harms. And my view also is that the entire community, not just those who were disadvantaged, is better off when a community is served by transportation infrastructure that does in fact connect more than it divides.
Well, that sounds pretty good rhetorically, but in reality, what we know is that this money pit in California that's largely being subsidized by federal tax dollars is doing exactly what you purport to prevent with this $1 billion allocation. So I think that is worth revisiting at some point to determine if in fact certainly that's happening. Is that a good expenditure of money? But let me move on in the interest of time. Ranking Member Graves mentioned a 550% increase in inflation since your boss took office. That's wreaking havoc on our economy. It's destroying particularly transportation businesses. That includes the small suppliers and the disadvantaged business enterprises that work in that space. Companies just can't afford to cash flow this increased inflation and shoulder that risk. And what's worse is it's creating a vacuum in the marketplace that allows for foreign companies to come in and further decimate U.S. industries and economies. So my question is, can DOT provide guidance to states and other recipients that inflation adjustments are required in transportation contracts?
So cost containment is a major focus for us right now in implementing the law, because we're hearing this from both project sponsors and the business community. The impact of cost escalation and inflation is unquestionably going to affect our ability to deliver. I'm less sure that this is something that would put U.S. companies at a disadvantage to international companies, for the simple reason that inflation is international. I was just in Germany a few months ago. Inflation there is somewhere around 8 or 9%. So a German company, I imagine, would face the same kind of cost escalation.
With respect, I'm less concerned about a German company and more concerned about a Chinese company, which subsidize at a much, much higher rate than anybody else. And they do that obviously for reasons to disrupt our economy and to jeopardize our national security. So that's my focus there, is to make sure we're not creating an opportunity for Chinese SOEs to come in and occupy space that should be occupied by U.S. businesses, and particularly these DBEs that we're trying to ensure have an opportunity to perform in that marketplace. But let me move on. Has DOT performed a legal analysis to see what is possible?
To see what is possible to address inflation?
Sure.
Sure, we're looking at it every day. We don't need legal analysis to tell us that we've got to make sure that
I'm talking about the contracting process.
You mean in terms of imposing a new requirement on the states?
Yes.
I have not addressed imposing additional requirements on the states for this purpose, but we could certainly look into that if you
So what I'm asking is, for contract reviews to address inflation, has there been a legal analysis there? Because when this was implemented, and we've seen inflation continue on an upward trajectory, and there were no provisions offered to address that. And so we're seeing that it's very, very difficult for companies to maintain pace with this rate of inflation. And so I guess what I'm asking is, are contracts firm? Are they fixed? Or is there any provisions in place for them to address that inflation?
So often contracts will have a contingency factor that can affect any unanticipated pressure on prices.
In this case, do they have a contingency factor?
Again, it would depend on the specific program involved, but would certainly welcome a chance to work with your office to see if you agree that that's adequately contemplated in the contract framework.
And any other provisions being discussed about what can be done for, what DOT can do to help small businesses and DBEs continue to participate in this market?
A couple of things that we think can be helpful here. One, of course, is simply doing everything we can to ensure that projects move forward swiftly, right? The greater the rate of inflation, the greater the cost of delay. And so as we're looking at everything from technical assistance to support moving through the permitting process, that's something that becomes even more important in a high inflation environment. Other mechanisms that I think could make a difference here are ones that could look at the timing of the spikes that you see in the cost of some of the different inputs. Not that you can predict the divergence between, let's say, the cost of steel to the cost of labor 3 years from now, but there may be ways to help project sponsors like transit agencies or state highway departments at least map out where some of the bulges are likeliest to occur in the availability or the restriction of supply. And I think that could make a difference too. So that's an example of the kind of thing we're exploring with them as we partner to try to make sure we get the absolute most value for these taxpayer dollars.
Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. We now turn to Representative